Now, it has been just under 2 weeks since the fall of the Syrian regime after a shock offensive carried out by rebels. It saw the president Bashar al-Assad flee to Russia after more than 50 years of dynastic dictatorship and brutal rule. Middle East correspondent Gareth Browne was there reporting from the scene, and the new leadership started to form. He was one of the first foreign journalists in Syria after the fall of the Assad regime, and I'm pleased to say he joins me in the studio now to give me details of experience. Gareth, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jeff.
What was it like being one of the first journalists in Syria after the fall of the regime?
Yeah, I mean, it was a kaleidoscope of emotions and experiences.
Mm-hmm.
I think, I've been based in Beirut for quite a while, and along with a lot of other journalists there, we've covered Syria from afar for many years. It's 14 years since that revolution turned into a civil war, and sort of getting into Syria became very, very difficult and very rare. And then suddenly, almost overnight, the regime collapsed, and I was sat in Beirut, and news that Assad had fled spread, and so me and a colleague jumped in a taxi, and we just went to the border, and we got stamped out of Lebanon, walked to the Syrian side, and when we went to get our passport stamped on the Syrian side, there was nobody there. Nobody to stamp our passports, so we took another taxi and we were in Damascus, and there we were in, a new chapter of Syria after 50 years of dictatorship. It was amazing, yeah.
I guess it takes an unusual personality to look at that, where there's potentially an atmosphere of both vengeance and apprehension, and to have that journalistic intent to go, that's where I want to be. Did you feel? Was your adrenaline up? Did you feel anxious the further you travelled and got towards Damascus?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the road into Damascus was that itself was incredible. You kind of come down the hill into the city. There's all these abandoned tanks and all these soldiers' uniforms lying on the floor, and then some of the rebels come out, and these are guys. Some of them wearing balaclavas. They've got AK-47. Some of them have big bushy beards, and from afar you're a bit apprehensive. But the closer you get to them, you see these big smiles on their face. They say, "Welcome to Syria," and they're really. Everyone I met was really happy we were there as foreign press.
But do you have an escort at a moment like that? Do you have any security or close protection?
No, I mean our security is our intuition. It's our knowledge. It's our expertise. We sort of rely on our instincts in those moments.
Yeah, I mean, it's impressive to be there at that. As the hand of history is literally upon you.
Yeah.
As reports emerged, there are new revelations about the regime that are just beyond imagination. It was already thought that this was a brutal regime, but it does seem that it's gone beyond what anybody could have reasonably expected. Which things do you know to be true, and which things have shocked even you?
I think it's right. I mean, we all know it was a brutal dictatorship, but I think before the regime fell and before everyone, this kind of all this transparency sort of developed, 2 weeks ago, I think even our imaginations were restricted. Our imaginations wouldn't quite let us reach, the darkest depths. As soon as I got in, I went to Sednaya, which is, that is the epitome of Assad's oppression. I wrote in my dispatch that the Sednaya was to Assad what the gulags were to Stalin. And you walk around that prison when we were there, it was late at night, hundreds, if not thousands of people there, hundreds of fighters from all different factions, people desperately, trying to find out what's happened to their loved ones. And the prison itself is sort of normal. But as you walk around a prison, it's the details you pick up on. Mm. So I remember seeing a prosthetic leg just sat there, and who's, the owner of that prosthetic leg was nowhere to be seen. You see things etched on the walls, you see, you'd look at the cell, and from afar, the cell looks what you'd expect a prison cell to look like, and then you see that they've actually knocked through at the back, and you sort of peek in like you're peeking into an attic, and then there's dozens, if not hundreds, of blankets there which are sodden, bottles in the corner full of urine, the most desperate things scribbled on the wall. And I think there, in those moments, you realise that your imagination fails you. And we're just scratching the surface.
So are we talking about, in those situations, potentially political prisoners or dissidents?
Overwhelmingly. I mean, I think those prisons, I think you have to assume that the vast majority of people in them were. These were not holding, petty criminals. And I think you have to remember that as that revolution turned into a civil war, this regime got a lot more authoritarian. It was arresting a lot more people. It was torturing a lot more people. It needed to build bigger mass graves. It needed more prison space. And it was, doing what it could to kind of suppress dissent in every way imaginable.
I mean, one thing you find with dictators is the people close to them, whether it be their sons, their brothers. There's often a sort of a web of people exploiting that power, and there are strange reports about Bashar's brother Mahir being a drug lord. What can you tell us about this?
I think that was an effect of sanctions. You know, Syria has been under one of the most oppressive international sanctions regimes probably in history. And when we look back, I think we'll see Syria as a good case study of sanctions being effective. You know, this collapse of the regime was essentially economic. But as these sanctions started to bite, we saw Assad and his cronies turning to, you know, the drug in particular is Captagon, which is sort of like a speed, which has become very popular in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, places like that. It's a party drug, essentially. And they were just producing this stuff and shipping it out and making a lot of money. You know, they turned from running a state to gangsters, to a mafia. And that became, you know, in the last 5-6 years, that was their main source of decades. So the money they've got tucked away in places like the Gulf, in Russia, a lot of it is from this Captagon trade, which has poisoned societies in the Arab world and parts of Europe.
I mean, just one last question looking ahead. With this new leadership of HTS, with the bounty being removed on the leader, what sort of rule can you envisage for Syria? Is there often that thing where people are optimistic or hopeful? And as we saw in Afghanistan, there was no such thing. What is the next 5 years like for Syria?
Nobody knows for sure, but I feel as an outsider, it's my duty to be optimistic. I mean, you know, this week I was in the torture cells. I was in a mass grave 3 days ago, and I'm convinced like nothing can be worse than the Syrian people than what they've just been through. And I'm not naive. I don't think we're going to end up with a small L, small d liberal democracy, you know, in a year or two. But what you're seeing now is a space where Syrians they've got these newfound freedoms, the ability to speak out, and they're loving it. They're exercising it, and they're happy. And you know, we don't know. Is this going to be a slightly Islamist regime? It's possible. You know, it's up to the Syrians to work that out. They've got this transitional government, which has sort of been running the rebel-held areas. So that's in place until March. And that's going to be a real indicator. HTS have been saying all the right things so far. They've been saying that they want to be inclusive. They're going to protect minorities. And they've been doing that. I've seen they've done that in the 2 weeks since they captured Damascus and Aleppo before that. So far, so good. But, you know, I think March, when they announce this, what happens with this transitional government is going to be important. It will give us a glimpse of what a future Syria is going to look like.
Does it, so far from what you've seen, does he seem the leader like somebody that UK diplomats could do business with? There's certainly, it feels like the West are certainly trying to create a space where consensus and dialogue is possible.
I think he is someone you can work with. I think everything I've seen from him and from HTS is that they're super pragmatic. You know, they're currently negotiating with the Russians. The Russians have spent the last decade bombing hospitals and schools in rebel-held Aleppo. Yet here are HTS thinking, if we can get something from this for the Syrian people out of the Russians, then there's a deal to be done here. And you know, I think we put too much emphasis on ideology. We think of Jalani, we think of HTS as Islamists. And that's the kind of primary definition we use for them. But actually, from what I've seen, these people are motivated by something different. They're motivated by the horrors that they've seen in Sednaya. That's what drives them. And so they're almost defining themselves in opposition to Assad's cruelty. So I don't think the fact that these guys are Islamists, and obviously there's questions about Jalani's past. You know, let's not pretend he wasn't involved in Al-Qaeda.
There was a bounty for a reason.
Yeah, exactly. But, you know, we have to look at Syria in 2024. And I think you have to engage. You have to give it a chance. It can't be worse than what's come before.
Okay, on that optimistic note, yeah, let's hope that for 2025 there is a more peaceful future there. That was Middle East correspondent Gareth Browne in the studio talking to us about what happened in Syria.